Muhammad was 40 years old and living among an idolatrous people when he received the very first revelation, a short divine text of 5 verses that commanded him to read in the name of a unique creator. Muhammad was from a land that was in full metamorphosis, even before his birth around 570 AD. Announced by Christ himself according to the Quran, the founder of Islam was declared the seal of the prophets, the ultimate messenger of God, in the very book revealed to him. Already fatherless, at 5 Muhammad lost both his mother and then his grandfather, a patriarch of Mecca who adored him. Raised from then on by his uncle, Muhammad had a very modest childhood and learned the profession of caravan driver as he grew older. Highly regarded by all who knew him, at 25 he married Khadija, an older, wealthy Meccan woman.
مشى الرعار قرأ اسم ربك قرأ اسم ربك نزل عليه الوحي وجاء خديجة يتخلج كل بكلاله يتخلج وعليه يتخلج وعليه الرعدية بالزوق بحد ما لقى خديجة مشيت كانت هزت ولد عمها ورق وقالت له رو محمد رو جاء من الغار رو هكا رو عليه سخان ورا عادية ومريض مش قد قال هذاك ننزل على موسى رو سوى النبي فرحت خديجة ومشيت بشرت وقالت له سوى النبي.
Did this first revelation really take place in the cave at Hira as tradition maintains? Nothing could be less certain. The Quran, by far the most reliable source we have, doesn't breathe a word about this cave. The surah or chapter of the sun and that of the star talk about a clear horizon before which Muhammad, though lucid, saw an apparition by a tree, perhaps a jujube tree. He then fell into a state of agitation.
Every prophet, every bearer of a divine message, has experienced this state. It's a state over which they have no control. Rather, they are submerged and controlled by it. It is a state induced by the contact between an individual and mysterious forces that are unknown to us.
The revelations came to the Prophet in different forms. Sometimes he saw nothing. A message would come to his mind and he would memorize it and then transmit it to others. Sometimes he saw the angel in human form. The angel would recite several verses of the Quran, which the Prophet would then convey to his people.
The Prophet received the revelations in very diverse situations, awake, asleep, sometimes during battle, other times during migration. The fact that he never received the verses in the same manner is a characteristic of the science of revelation.
This raises another question that concerns the concept of revelation. Does revelation come in the form of words or ideas? Does God speak Arabic, Hebrew, or Aramaic? Does God speak a human language?
Islamic tradition acknowledges Muhammad's panic after the shock of revelation. His wife Khadija introduced him to a close relative, her cousin Waraka, who reassured him and saw him as a prophet. Legend goes on to say that even stones spoke to him, greeting him as the messenger of God that he was.
أول حدث كان في إنزال النبي في سبيل الدعوة الإسلامية والنشرة لما الله أنزل عليه إنه وأنذر عشيرتك الأقربين إنه ينذر أهله وأقاربه فهو بطريقة يعني إنه حتى يقبلوا عزمهم وعمل الوليمة وبعد ما انتهت الوليمة دعاهم للإسلام ويعني وقال لهم الحقيقة وصارحهم بالشيء اللي هو نزل عليه إنه هو النبي وهو اللي الله بعته مشان ينذرهم نار جهنم ويبعتهم ويخرجهم من النار إلى الجنة. فمنهم من تبعه ومنهم من أعرض واستسخف هذا الشيء ومن اللي أعرضوا عمه الطاغي أبو لهب كان كتير ظالم وكان كافر فهو لما سمع هذا الشيء استسخف هذا الشيء وقال له إنه تبا لك لهذا جمعتنا فالله مستحيل يعني يقبل إنه هيك نبي الله إنه ينهان أو شيء فالله انتقاما للنبي ولحتى يستبد له حقه من عمه الطاغي أنزل سورة المسد وهي التي تقول أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم تبت يدا أبي لهب وتب ما أغنى عنه ماله وما كسب سيصلى نارا ذات لهب وامرأته حمالة الحطب في جيدها حبل من مسد صدق الله العظيم.
برافو الإناث صليت على سفولة الإناث. مين بتحكي لنا قصة سورة الضحى وسبب نزولها؟ تعالي أنا.
Khadija was the first woman to believe in Muhammad's mission. Among men, the first convert to the new message was his perennial friend, Abu Bakr, a trader of modest means. Tradition identifies Muhammad's cousin Ali as the first child to enter Islam. This was Muhammad's original core of followers, his wife, a mature spouse, a man of his own age, and a boy of 10.
In the name of God, the All-Merciful. The thundering. What is the thundering? The day humans scatter like moths, when mountains are like tufts of carded wool. Then he who weighs down the balance shall know a life of contentment, while he who is lighter in the balance shall have before him nothing but an abyss. What will convey to you what this is? The fire that burns you. Surah 101, verses 1 through 9.
In the early period, those first revelations, very intense, very focused on the idea of the oneness of God and the call to judgment, the call to accountability of human beings who are to be submissive to God and to God's will. The very vivid imagery of those early revelations reflect a period in the life of the prophet where he was preaching with intensity a new message.
He said to them, "Follow me, I will make you into people of noble lineage, and after, you too will possess the wealth of Khosrow and Caesar." He was perceptive enough to realize that the Roman and Persian empires were declining, that the region would no longer be dominated, and that it was necessary to fill the void.
The Quraysh were not immediately aware of the danger. It was only when the Prophet attacked their idols that they began to feel threatened.
Idol worship was the very pillar of Quraysh commerce. He had to fight the Quraysh. He had to rise up against them.
There is also a class element that explains why they refused to admit that Muhammad was the one chosen by God to deliver his message. They believed that God would have chosen the most distinguished person as his messenger, not someone of low social standing.
How could he prove that those who chose to follow him would be treated like family? His slave Zaid, who had been offered to him by his wife Khadija, said, "I am a Muslim." And the Prophet said to him, "I give you the best of lineages. You are my son." And he declared to the Quraysh, "I present to you Zaid, son of Mohammed." Then the poor flocked to embrace the new teaching.
For the handful of converts to the new religion, the ritual of prayer was far from firmly established. At the time, the small group's practice was more meditative than ceremonial. Following the rhythm of the sun, perhaps 3 times a day, they excused themselves from daily life for a few moments to recite some of the short Quranic passages that had by then been revealed.
إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم.
The idea of a face of God before which one stands and prostrates oneself in order to execute a proper prayer must have existed, linked to the figure of Abraham, who, as the Quran states, migrated towards the face of God. For the time being, believers faced northward toward the holiest of cities, Jerusalem, already consecrated by the 2 other monotheistic faiths to which Muhammad was connected.
The Quran is the compilation of a series of verses transmitted by the Prophet. These verses were memorized, recorded, and later collected. Their final compilation was undertaken during the Caliphate of Ottoman.
Muslim tradition holds that the Quran was revealed gradually over a period of 23 years in the form of groups of verses.
We thus have a text that was constructed over the course of history. It wasn't handed down to us all at once. In the first historical period, it served a specific function, while in the second phase, it served another, different function.
فلو نزل جملة واحدة لقالوا إنه عثر على كتاب مدفون أما حينما يلازمه جبريل فهذا ليس من عند أحد إلا من عند من يعلم السر.
Each series of verses was grouped with others to form a section called a surah. Thus the text consists of 114 surahs that all, except for one, begin with the words, "In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful."
There are narrative elements, but there are also elements of liturgical prayer. There are elements of course, legislative force that eventually become an important part of Islamic law. There are ritual instructions. There are oaths. There is vivid imagery of many different kinds.
إذا نزل في وقت حدوث المشكلة يفسرها ويوضحها ويطمئن الجميع إلى أن هذا ليس من عند محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم.
المتكلم في القرآن هو الله.
The voice speaking in the Quran is that of God Himself and no one else. For the words of the Quran are not the words of a human being. It is important to understand that these are not the words of Mohammed.
When heaven shall cleave asunder, and the stars be dispersed, and the sea waters churn, and the tombs be overturned, the soul shall see its actions, past and present. Mortal, who misled you against your generous master? Your master who created you, who gave perfection and precision to your form, who fashioned you in the form he intended. But you treat his religion as a lie. Guardians watch over you, honored guardians who record your actions. They know all that you do. The just shall find the journey of delights, and prevaricators find hell. On Judgment Day they shall be burned. They shall never get away. Surah 82, verses 1 to 16.
80% of the entire revelation was conveyed in Mecca. In this land of oral culture, jotting down sacred passages on whatever came to hand was inconceivable, even if the prophet could occasionally dictate what he received to scribes. The nature of the receptacle of the revelations, palm nuts, the shoulder blade of a dromedary, flat stones or goat skins, indicates that their inscriptions were temporary, meant to last only long enough to be committed faultlessly to memory. The fragments were kept in an order that had nothing to do with that of the surah, an order that would later be finalized under the authority of the third caliph Uthman. The initial chronological order, now unknown, must have embodied an entirely different aura, that of an infinite book revolving around monotheism.
It is written in the Quran, "Say, we believe in Allah and that which is revealed unto us and that which was revealed unto Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, and Jacob and the tribes, and that which was vouchsafed unto Moses and Jesus and the prophets from their Lord. We make no distinction between any of them."
Christians and Jews will often ask, well, is Allah, the God of Islam, the same God that we worship? And I would answer unequivocally, of course it is. Allah is simply the Arabic word for God.
Muhammad claimed from the outset that he was the last in a long chain of prophets sent by God.
We have constant affirmation that all the earlier prophets were Muslims. In other words, servants of God. Adam was a Muslim, Moses was a Muslim, Jesus was a Muslim, and so on. This means that Mohammed was sent to confirm the two previous messages.
It is all the same revelation, a revelation that was sent down to each community in their own language and in accordance with their own customs through the intermediary of a series of prophets chosen by God.
The Quran considers that all Jewish kings are prophets, whereas the Jews themselves do not regard their kings as prophets.
So the Muslims thought that the Jews and Christians would be their strongest allies, that they would follow the Prophet, or at the very least, not oppose him, since he preached the oneness of God, life after death, retribution and the final judgment, as well as acknowledging and believing in the old prophets. His message is identical to theirs.
اجتمع مرة إلى صناديد قريش وإلى زعمائهم وبدأ يعرض عليهم دعوته وجد منهم في ذلك الوقت آذانا صاغية، هم ينكرون في قلوبهم لكنهم أعطوه هذه الفرصة أن يتكلم ما شاء. في هذه الأثناء يدخل عليه بعض أصحابه سيدنا عبد الله بن أم مكتوم، وكان هذا رجلا ضريرا لا يرى، يريد أن يسأل النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام بعض الأسئلة من خصوصيات هذا الدين. وكان الصحابة لا يصنعون أمرا أو لا يتركون شيئا إلا وسألوا عنه النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام. لذلك جاء القرآن الكريم في كثير من المواضع يسألونك 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 وإذا سألك. جاء هذا الرجل سيدنا عبد الله بن أم مكتوم الرجل الضرير المكفوف الذي لا يرى، جاء إلى النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام ليسأله بعض أسئلة عن دينه وعن شريعته، فعبس النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام اكفهر وجهه لأنه رأى أن هذه الساعة لا توافق أن يلتقي مع عبد الله بن مكتوم طالما أن صناديد قريش فتحوا آذانهم الآن. ومع ذلك سجل الله عليه هذا الموقف، عاتبه القرآن الكريم، فأنزل الله عز وجل قوله تعالى: عبس وتولى أن جاءه الأعمى. لكن الله مع الحق، ولو كان حبيبه النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام، وكان الله عز وجل من أنصار الضعفاء على حساب السادات.
We have to distinguish between the prophet as a man and the prophet as a divine agent. The Quran admonishes him for an outburst of anger. He frowned and turned away because the blind man came unto him. It was a very human display of anger.
The Prophet Muhammad did not present himself as a prophet who was above human status, as someone infallible. On the contrary, he himself insisted on the fact that he was a mere human being.
Revelation applies to the message revealed, what the Quran calls an inspiration that is inspired. The rest of his words and deeds obey human impulses such as love, hate, and so on.
His efforts did not always produce the best response possible, nor the most perfect. And it was heavenly and divine revelation that set him straight, guiding him toward the path to total perfection.
Throughout the Prophet's life, this incident would serve as an incentive for him to re-examine his own personality in a critical light. Later, whenever the Prophet came across this blind man, he would greet him with the words, "Welcome to him on whose account Allah reproached me."
Allah.
The Prophet began speaking more and more openly of his mission and giving readings in public of the few fragments that came to him. He did this himself, sparing his companions the risk this entailed. The city was insecure, and Meccans shifted from indifference to hostility. Mohammed relied on clan solidarity. At the time, he enjoyed an immunity that protected him from the aggression of his increasingly numerous adversaries. His uncle Hamza, though initially incredulous, soon believed in his message and came to his aid.
إجا زلمة للنبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وقال له: يا محمد، شو رأيك إن تعبد إلهنا سنة ونحن بنعبد إلهك سنة؟ قام جاء له النبي قال له: يا زلمة الأمر ما بإيدي، استناني فترة من الزمن، سمع جاني شيء من عند الله. وبعد شوي نزل وحي. في بعض ناس بيقولوا إنه نزل بعد سنة. أنزل سورة الكافرون. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل يا أيها الكافرون لا أعبد ما تعبدون ولا أنتم عابدون ما أعبد ولا أنا عابد ما عبدتم ولا أنتم عابدون ما أعبد لكم دينكم ولي دين. صدق الله العظيم.
الله يعني معروف بصفاته.
God is known by his qualities, what we in Islam call the divine names of God. We know that God reveals himself to humans and the universe. He is the most merciful, the most compassionate. This is how he defines himself throughout the revelation.
Humans are God's creatures. They are God's servants. They are in a situation of voluntary submission to God. But God, for his part, offers full and complete guidance to human life.
God is the supreme creator, and he is also the creator of evil. The Quran does not express the same duality found in Zoroastrianism. We don't have two opposing principles. God dominates all.
The Lord of the worlds created impurity of the soul as well as piety. But he did not guide people toward impurity, only toward piety. This is a very important concept.
There's no concept of original sin. Adam asked for God's forgiveness immediately after committing his offense. He asked God to pardon him, and God pardoned him. End of story. When Muslims say, Inshallah, it's an expression of resignation, because they are convinced that God creates men, has them die, draws them to him, and surrounds them with his mercy. This is not an assertion that God directs their lives. They are not machines. Most of the Quran insists on the liberty and responsibility of man.
موسى كلم الله فكان ساير في طريقه وعابر على الناقة على جبل موسى متجه فوجد واحد حراث بيحرث قال يا موسى أنا بحرث من غير مطر وبرمي غلة في الأرض فأسأل الله أن في مطر والله ما فيش فراح موسى كلم ربه وسأله قال له عبدك فلان بيحرث وسألني في مطر ولا ما فيش قال له ما فيش مطر يا موسى فرجع موسى من الجبل اللي بكلم ربه عليه وفات على البدوي قال له يا ما تحرثش ربك بيقول ما فيش مطر ومشي في طريقه صار في طريقه وهذا فضل يحرث قال والله هو قال ما فيش مطر أنا حارث ومتوكل على الله للجمل بتاعه ربنا أكرمه بالمطر وصار عنده الزرع وموسى رجع عليه بعدين لقي عنده أرض يعني زارعة فقال له يا ربي أنت خليتني أكذب قال تأدب يا موسى لا يقصدني عبد ويخيب لازم من قصدني أعطيه فالراجل بعد أنت ما مشيت توكل علي ورزقته بالمطر.
The Messiah, also known as Jesus, he was the first Messiah. It is a word that appears in the Quran. He was a prophet like any other.
ولكن القرآن يرى
But the Quran considers that the Christians committed a grave error in deifying Christ, in considering him as a God, rather than as a mere prophet.
Islam insists that he was not crucified. They slew him not, nor crucified him. but it appeared so unto them.
It's interesting, in fact, to know that Mary is mentioned by name far more often in the Quran than in the New Testament, and certain aspects of the life of Mary are fleshed out in the Quran in a way that is not familiar to us from the biblical material.
Immortality in Sunni Islam is an immortality that involves the complete resurrection of the body and the soul, whether it is for an eternity in heaven or in hell.
Heaven and hell do not yet exist. They will appear on the ruins of this world. Just as we made the first creation, we will start over again. The day will come when the heavens and earth will be changed.
Sexual relations take place between the inhabitants of heaven and the Huri. We don't know how many of them there will be. 40, maybe 70, depending on the author. But there definitely is a more fulfilling and intense sexual activity.
Back in Mecca, protected by his social standing, Mohammed's safety was secure. So the Quraysh targeted those among his company who were the poorest and most vulnerable, foreigners or slaves like Bilal, those who possessed neither the glory of lineage nor the prestige of wealth.
فمنا الذين آمنوا لاقوا العذاب الشديد لاقوا عذاب شديد جدا حتى أن السيدة سمية رضي الله عنها وزوجها ياسر قتلهم أبو جهل يده بحربة قتلهم وكذلك بلال رضي الله عنه لاقى من العذاب ما لاقاه أيضا في الصحراء كانوا يضعون على صدره الصخر الكبير ويقول أحد أحد فلما رأى باقي المسلمين هذا العذاب استأذنوا النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم إلى الهجرة إلى الحبشة كانوا عددهم 8 ومن الرجال 2 من النساء وكانت هجرتهم في شهر رجب فلما وصلوا إلى شاطئ البحر استأجروا سفينة أقلتهم إلى بلاد الحبشة لأنهم علموا أن هناك فيها ملك صالح وهو آمن بعد النواة والنجاشي فمكثوا في بلاد الحبشة حوالي 3 أشهر.
Among the believers, the strongest men asked the Prophet to allow them to defend themselves by fighting the Quraysh. The Prophet answered, I have not received the command to fight.
To those who had been tortured before his eyes in Mecca, Bilal, Sumayyah, and Yasser, the Prophet said, Be patient, your place is in paradise. He did not say to their son Ammar, Avenge your father and your mother.
The pagan nobles of Quraysh couldn't believe the news coming from Abyssinia, that Negus, the king of this African country, was willing to receive the delegation rushed to him by Mohammed and led by his young cousin Jafar. The Meccans in turn sent a mission demanding that the rebels be turned over to them. Jafar was able to win the king over with a touching plea preserved in the Chronicles of the period.
حينما حدثه عن الإسلام قال أيها الملك كنا قوما أهل جاهلية نعبد الأصنام ونأكل الميتة ونأتي الفواحش ونقطع الرحم ونسيء الجوار هذه هي الجاهلية حتى بعث الله فينا رجلا نعرف أمانته وصدقه وعفافه ونسبه فدعانا إلى الله لنعبده ونوحده ونخلع ما كان يعبد آباؤنا من الحجارة والأوثان وأمرنا بصدق الحديث وأداء الأمانة وصلة الرحم وحسن الجوار والكف عن المحارم والدماء كأن هذا هو الإسلام.
Like his great predecessors, Muhammad endured tragedy and tribulation, but the famous incident of the satanic verses is unique in the history of religion. Everyone knows about Moses' anger in breaking the tablets of the commandments, about Jesus' revolt against the silence of God on the Mount of Olives. In this case, the spirit of evil commands the prophet to say something other than what God actually revealed to him.
تقول هذه الرواية إن الشيطان وسوس للنبي.
This story tells of how Satan tempted the prophet into adding a sentence to the revelation concerning Al-Lat and Al-Uzza and Manat the third. It said, "These are the exalted women, and their intercession is desired indeed." And the Quraysh rejoiced at this and said to him, "Since you recognize our gods, we in turn shall recognize your God." But a few days later, God Almighty reprimanded him and sent down the following verse, "They are but names which you have named, you and your fathers, for which Allah has revealed no warrant." So the two previous sentences were then suppressed, and the new verse attacked the goddesses in the surah known as Al-Naim, the star. These two sentences are known as the satanic verses. Certain Muslim chroniclers mention them in their accounts of the Prophet's life, but most scholars claim that this story was invented, that it is pure fabrication, that it is untrue.
Tradition could have easily deleted this passage. So many other incidents were simply removed from the official texts. But that was not the case for this episode. While it's true that the so-called satanic verses were deleted from the text of the Quran, Arab commentators tend to include them in their telling of the story. So we have a curious form of transmission through denial.
هاجر المسلمون إلى الحبشة ابتعادا عن إيذاء المشركين، وعندما وصلوا إلى النجاشي في الحبشة أشيع خبر أن قريش دخلت في الإسلام جميعها. هنالك روايات عديدة تقول أن الرسول عليه الصلاة والسلام كان يتمنى أن الله سبحانه وتعالى يذكر قريش بشيء يخصهم في القرآن الكريم حتى يستميلهم إلى الإسلام. وتقول الرواية بأن الرسول عليه الصلاة والسلام كان في المسجد وصلى، ودخل المشركون خلف الرسول في الصلاة، وورد ذكر قصة القرانيق والتي يقول فيها تلك القرانيق العلا وإن لشفاعتهن لترجى. وكان بعض المشركين خلف الرسول عليه الصلاة والسلام، فسجد الرسول وسجد من كان من قريش معه. كان معظم قريش لما سمعوا بذكر هذه الآلهة سجدوا مع المسلمين، ظنا منهم بأن الله سبحانه وتعالى خصهم بهذه الذكرى. وشيع هذا الخبر في الحبشة عند المسلمين المهاجرين من مكة المكرمة، وظنوا بأن قريش دخلت إلى الإسلام وبذلك يكتفون شرهم.